Thanks for coming, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces and some faces I do not recognise. You're more than welcome here, and thanks to Rationalist House for hosting this event. I'm a representative of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and if you're wondering who Platypus is, you might have seen our posters on campus or our logo floating around, maybe on Instagram, that sort of thing. The Platypus Affiliated Society is an educational organisation devoted to understanding the left. It was established in December 2006 in Chicago and focuses on the problems and tasks inherited from what we call the old left. So that's the 1920s to 30s, the new left, 1960s to 70s, give or take, and the post-political left, 80s to 90s. And we try and investigate for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Can I ask if anyone here identifies as left or has a history in left organisations or, yeah? I mean, you'll be more than welcome if you're not, that's totally fine, but just curious to get like a read on the room sort of thing. Basically, we put out public-facing material, including events such as this one. We do panels, so we might get a wide variety of voices on the left to sit on a table just like this one and talk through points regarding the history of the left and see where the points of agreement and disagreement lie. We also do film screenings. We do a podcast called Shit Platypus Says that you can find online. We run a monthly publication called the Platypus Review, which is on that table, and I think some of you have copies. And we host a reading group. And that's basically what this event is here to advertise, is the reading group, and see if anyone's interested in participating and coming along and that sort of thing. And I will be covering material that we cover in that reading group. So this is technically called a teach-in. It comes from a long tradition on the left of there'll be student occupations on campus in the 1960s, that sort of thing, where there might be a professor of history or philosophy or sociology or whatever, delivering a kind of presentation on something related to politics and the left. Today, though, we're meeting here at Rationalist House and we'll be talking about this notion of what capital means in history and what relevance it has to Marxism. So really the meaning of Marxism. But before I get stuck into it, I'll just give you the particulars regarding that reading group that we'll be running. It'll be every Tuesday at 6 p.m. at Samoa House Library on K Road, starting August 22nd, so that's in about 3 weeks from now. And if you want to take part in that, feel free to pop your name on the handout I gave with the names and emails, and we can let you know more about that. I've been running an art and politics reading group via Zoom, which Luke attended, and that was just kind of an interim reading group. It has only lasted 8 weeks, and I think we've got 2 more weeks to go. But the reading group that starts in 3 weeks recurs every year. So if you miss this round, then you can jump in next year, sort of thing. It contains a lot of material that is close to the history of Marxism. So not just reading Marx, not just reading Engels, but reading all sorts of stuff around it. We read the revolutionary radical bourgeois Enlightenment thinkers, as they're known: Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Adam Smith. We read Marx and Engels, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, the Frankfurt School, a whole variety of different stuff. And the great thing is that even if it goes over your head the first time, you can always jump back in or in and out if you've got studies and that sort of thing. And as for me, I've been through the reading group 2.5 years now. So the function of this event is more or less for me to share what I've learned and to kind of learn by teaching as well. As I mentioned, I think informally just at the start, this is the second version of this teaching I've given. I gave one last year, but that was a bit more scripted, and I'm trying to make this one a bit more casual, feel more like a tutorial sort of thing. And hopefully the outcome of this would be that you would feel empowered to take up texts you wouldn't normally think of reading. Perhaps you don't have a history reading dry, older material necessarily, and it might feel kind of like arcane to you at first glance. So the purpose of this event is to maybe give you the tools to help you feel like you can actually read this stuff, because anyone can, really. If teachers have us reading Shakespeare in high school, we can read classical Marxism. So I'll talk for an hour, followed by a brief Q&A, and the way that I'll structure it is chronologically, because the main thrust of it has to do with history. And it will take me a while to get to Marxism, so I apologise in advance if you're kind of like, what is this guy rabbiting on about? But we will get there, and it will hopefully make sense by the end of it. So, with all the preamble out of the way, I want to start with a question that to some people might seem provocative and to others might seem obvious, depending on who you ask. And that question is, does Marxism even matter? Which is the subtitle of this event. So I want to put it to you, is this a question that people are familiar with? Or are there versions of this question that you're used to hearing in your day-to-day life? Have you come across people saying this sort of thing? Like, does Marxism even matter? Or why should I care about Marxism? That sort of thing? Yeah?
Yeah.
I'm hearing some other, I'm seeing some nods and what are some other, varieties that you might hear? Like, what are some responses that people might have?
Well, it depends what you define as Marxism. Maybe some of those ideas are present in the media we consume that aren't labeled necessarily as Marxism.
Sure.
There seems to be there seems to be general post-Cold War sentiment that post-USSR sentiment, and there also but I lately in academic circles and stuff, there seems to be a weird post-left sentiment from the left as well. Maybe a sort of resignment. It's really
great.
But yeah, there seems to be even a right-wing, left-wing side. So does even Marxism matter to it as well?
Yeah.
I feel like it's somewhat prevalent nowadays still. It's still a pressing question. People still skepticism about it.
So we see how sentiment travels in waves, as it were, and time seems to intervene on how discourse is shaped relative to political movements. Yeah, that's really good. Any other kind of varieties?
That there's a sense that Marxism was this real ideal, and then in practice it just failed and it turned into totalitarianism. I felt that's the prominent ideology of high school and stuff like that.
Yeah. I think I was taught that in high school even, and there's actually a Simpsons quote where Homer says exactly that as a joke, but he's communism, it's like communism, Marge, communism sounds great on paper but it fails in practice, that sort of thing. So clearly it's, in the air, as it were. We take it for granted that Marxism appears at least a foregone conclusion. Now, I'm not saying everyone in this room believes that, but that's what we're used to hearing, and that's what we prepare ourselves for, yeah?
I think a relevant question, a counter question to the one you posed, would be if communism failed, does that imply that capitalism has succeeded, or is succeeding?
Yeah.
Great.
I think that's probably what we're told a lot of the time, right? Yeah.
Right, and what does that success actually look like?
Yeah.
Great.
It's implied, right? It's always only implied by saying communism fails, and therefore, not that therefore it's never set up. It's always therefore we gotta stick with this, and it's better, and whatever.
Yeah, that's great. That's really key. What is assumed, right? What are the preconceptions behind these ideas? And how is that informing the way that people theorize and speculate about the present, but also the future? Now here comes the interesting part. I don't want us to take it for granted that I assume that Marxism is a tenable theory today. Rather, I want to start from scratch, which is to say that rather than providing answers, I want to try and clarify what the questions might be, to try and understand what preconceptions inform these ideas in the present. And as far as problems go, one clear problem is that capitalism and socialism, at least as ideas, appear to be in opposition to each other. So on the one side of the barricades, you've got capitalism, and on the other side, you've got socialism, and they just kind of duke it out until one side wins. And right now, people seem to take it for granted that socialism has lost and capitalism has won. Maybe not. There are plenty of people who believe that socialism is on the up and up as well. But nonetheless, that's what frames this this duality, you might call it, or an antinomy, meaning like an opposition where both sides can't be true. But for Marx, what we'll look at today is how it isn't so clear-cut necessarily as socialism versus capitalism. And we'll get there, but first we need to understand what Marxism actually was. And to do that, we need to inhabit the self-understanding of Marxism and Marxists. So when I say the word self-understanding, what I'm referring to there is really taking up the thinking of historical Marxism at its strongest, rather than teaching Marxism through the prism of today, where we're like, here's how we judge Marxism according to the long afterglow or shadow that it's left on history. We want to try and get in a time machine and be like, well, here was Marxism at its historical peak. Here was when, at least numerically, there were the most people who self-consciously called themselves Marxists and were doing something about it. And why did they take it for granted that revolution was around the corner, right? Or perhaps another alternative, maybe socialist reform, whatever, it doesn't matter. The idea is to simply get into this period, which was roughly the mid to late 19th century, early 20th century. If you think roughly like, pre-World War I, maybe give or take some decades, that's kind of the parameters we're placing on it. So what did they take for granted? What were their preconceptions? Well, to answer that question, we face yet another stumbling block, and that is that we don't actually live in their time. And it might be hard to recover the memory of what they took for granted. In fact, we might even face obfuscation and misrecognition of what Marxism even is, or perhaps even was. And resolving this impasse is why an organisation like Platypus exists. I should clarify at this juncture that we're not a political organisation in the sense that we don't have a program, meaning we're not affirmative or positive. Like, we don't get out in the streets and hand out our paper. We don't, individual members attend demos and protests, and members of trade unions, whatever else. But that's secondary to the main point of Platypus, which is to try and understand the left and try and work through it. And that involves taking up what the problems that the left faces are, what are its ideological barriers, both from without but also from within, what it perpetuates. So we're trying to shine a light really on how theory has been separated from political practice. So that question that we started with, like, why does Marxism or revolutionary socialism appear a highfalutin ideal that can't be mobilised in practice? Why do so many people seem to take that for granted? That would be a separation of theory and practice. Theory here just referring to the broader sense of the word, just any intellectual activity. And that's basically what this talk will focus on. So if we want to understand what Marx's project is in his own time, in his own lifetime, a good place to start, of course, would be Marx's own words. On the handout I gave you, there's, I can't remember which page it is. I think it's the first page. It starts with Marx from what's known as the Grundrisse, which is German for like floor plans or blueprints. Basically, it's the text that he wrote as a self-clarification effort in his process of drafting Das Kapital. And here he's really telling the story of modern society. So, to start with, what is progress, if not the absolute elaboration of humanity's creative dispositions, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself, the absolute movement of becoming? Now, if that already threw you off, that's fine. I want to kind of start with a text that might appear, opaque, or use words that you might not be used to reading, so that we can eventually work through it and, try and get to the bottom of it. And to make that easier, I'm going to write on the whiteboard a term that he applies, which is the following word, becoming. And we'll revisit this term and try and figure out kind of what he's implying by that. But I'll just keep ploughing on to see if it makes any more sense in context. So he goes on to say, the ancient conception in which man always appears as the aim of production seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals, produced in universal exchange? What, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature as well as those of so-called nature? What, if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions, without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, i.e. the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation and the destruction of all fixed, one-sided purposes, as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior, and this is so insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or where it appears to be satisfied with itself is vulgar and mean. And once again, if that appeared to you opaque, that is totally fine. The main thing really to take away from it are the key terms and what he is kind of continually circling around in his in his writing there. So we've already got becoming. I'm going to write some other related terms that will help us kind of ground what he is addressing. So I'm going to write ancient and modern. So two things to note with the general thrust of what he's writing here. Marx appears to be counterposing two categories of thought, more or less. He appears to be splitting it down the middle between ancient and modern. But interestingly, he seems ambivalent, as though neither is preferable to the other. So he's not advocating the modern over the ancient, necessarily, nor is he advocating the ancient over the modern. What do these terms ancient and modern mean? Well, we need to decouple it a bit from our kind of everyday vernacular sort of connotations with those words. Here, ancient and modern should be understood as relative terms, basically. So the word ancient is derived from the Latin word ante, A-N-T-E, which means before. Modern is derived from the Latin modo, which means now. My way of remembering this is basically that I think of the Ancien regime, which is referring to, you know, the monarchy prior to the French Revolution. That's like the old regime, right? The old order. And in that sense, you can understand ancient not as meaning like antiquity or, you know, like ancient Egypt or Greece or Rome or something like that, but rather just simply that which came before, the current way of being. And of course, modern then just means that which is current. Yep.
Or you could say, because the ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, so you could always define ancient in terms of you know, the satisfaction it provides. It's narrow. Like, you know, anything that is ancient will not have variety or something like that. Will not have,
Sure. Yeah, and we'll see what that means when we start talking about the ancient way of life, particularly with relation to how people related to themselves and others, but also everything that they're born into as well. So yeah, that's great.
Do you want to repeat that question?
What's that?
Do you want to repeat the question?
Okay, I'll do it moving forward. Yeah, it's good. That's good advice. Now, when people in Marx's era spoke of ancient life, this really gets at that point. They mean traditional customs and practices, such as living off the countryside, which was originally enabled by agriculture, animal husbandry, and all that sort of thing. So that included medieval Europe as well. And originally that emerged with what's known as the Neolithic era, which kind of emerges around 10,000 BC. It's the first time that you get humans transitioning from kind of nomadic, hunter-gatherer kind of migratory lifestyles into what's known as sedentary or nuclear forms of social organization, which produces the first forms of writing and religion and art and kind of social stratification as well. And what's important to note here is that this is broad brushstrokes, and it describes a part of a historical process. And by that, I mean it's a systematic or universal way of looking at civilization. So it might be archaeological fundamentally, but it's not anthropological. It's not achieving to do that necessarily. With a lot of what I'm talking about today, it's going to be general and universal rather than particular or specific, is my point. So to continue this thread then of why Marx is taking up the idea of the ancient way of life, remembering once again that, like this could be as recent as medieval Europe, he talks about humanity as the aim of production in traditional society. He means the human capacity to produce a certain way of understanding, a way of understanding oneself or of other humans and of nature. And nature is very important to traditional life, and we'll see why. So I'm going to write this on the whiteboard as well. Where should I put it? I'm going to put it down here. Okay. Because in traditional society, where life is a cycle, culture reflects the patterns of nature, from the rhythms of day and night, the calls of animals, the seasons, the tides, and the lunar cycle. It's a very basic kind of way of looking at it. But the reason why that is significant for German philosophy, from which Marx kind of came out of this tradition known as German idealism. You might have heard of the young Hegelians or the left Hegelians, who came out of this tradition founded by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, famous early 19th century philosopher. And Marx is one of these young Hegelians. For them, nature isn't to be taken as biological, physical nature, but means something different. So I'm going to bracket the E here, and that shows that the way that it's spelled in the German is just like N-A-T-U-R, just nature. And that means what you're born into. It means the extant or the given, the same, basically. It might mean biological or physical nature as well, but it means something much broader as well. And to explain this, there's a really helpful quote on the handout that I've given out by this cultural critic guy from, I think he's from New York, I think he's American, this guy Louis Menand. And he's describing this idea of nature under so-called kind of ancient society, or that which came before. He says, in pre-modern societies, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. Meaning is immanent, meaning internal or from within, in all the ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these are inherited from the past and are therefore worth reproducing. The idea is to make the world go, not forward, only around. In a convenient shorthand to describe this general tendency, this way of relating to oneself and one's community, and also just to that which you're born into, is being. So these two terms, which come from philosophy, really speak to this kind of the split down the middle between that which came before and that which is current. Being and becoming, a state of being and a process of becoming. And we'll get into that a bit more in relation to what that means for nature and what that relates to. What the reverse, you might say, of that is, or what it unfolds into. From the vantage point of Marx's time, as far as we can say that there were freedoms in traditional society, they were freedoms that expressed an aim to continue life as it is, which is known as Aristotelian freedom, like the freedom that Aristotle wrote about. Freedom meant existing without interference, to remain unconquered, to not be sold into slavery, to not be crucified or burned at the stake, whatever else, which would have been comforting, say, if you were like a peasant, living in medieval Europe, where you're only as free as your place in the great chain of being. And for those who don't know, the great chain of being is basically like it's the notion of a divinely appointed hierarchy among all beings. So there's like a hierarchy between the species, but also within each species, there's even a hierarchy between among the angels all the way up to God, and God sanctifies and unifies, makes it all a thing. A way that manifests socially speaking is in the caste system. So you might have heard of this idea of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work in medieval and older society. And like the majority of people in that era, your relation to society as a whole was thought of as determined by nature or by divinity. So everything I've said so far has to do with the vantage point of Marx's time. And in order to understand why he's even talking about all this stuff in the first place, we have to understand what was going on in Marx's life and that which preceded. Like, what did he take for granted? And how was it different, specifically, from what came before? And this is where things get interesting, because we start talking about historical turning points. We start talking about the new and the different. So by the 1500s, roughly, there are a whole lot of different historical contingencies. Like, you've got the discovery of the Americas, you've got new trading routes opened up by fleets of trading ships coming out of the Dutch Republic and elsewhere. You've got the Protestant Reformation, the invention of the printing press, what else? The scientific revolution, and other things as well, that meant that the way of life began to change for the majority of the world's population. Slowly but surely, over centuries, this new way of life began to speak for all humans' existences, no matter how remote or far off the influence was felt. In terms of effects, the old feudal order of peasants, lords, kings, and churches began to buckle under the weight of this new order. And we call this a cosmological shift, meaning the way that people related to themselves and their surroundings and other people was like the appearance of a new cosmological order, a new cosmos. So artistically speaking, you've got the European Renaissance. The scientific or technical sense, you've got the scientific revolution. Cultural and religious, you've got Protestant, Christian Reformation. Economic, you've got capitalism. In the political sense, you've got this notion of like the modern republic as distinct from the ancient or Roman kind of republic. You've got liberal democracy, and in terms of philosophy, you've got the Enlightenment, which is really what Marx is kind of taking up, this Enlightenment tradition and trying to work through it. And what this all amounts to is the feudal system giving way to bourgeois society. So I'll write this on the whiteboard as, hopefully I've got enough room, I might not, but I'll write it down the bottom and hopefully everyone can see. Maybe I'll just rub it off if it extends, if it self-extinguishes. There you go. Okay. Gesellschaft. So this is the way it's rendered in the German. And what it translates to is either bourgeois society or civil society. The question that might be asked is, what does Marxism have to do with being bourgeois? Don't Marxists hate, people who are bourgeois, that sort of thing? Well, we have to be historically specific when we think about this term, and that means decoupling it from its connotational or vernacular use. And in this sense, bourgeois doesn't mean the bourgeoisie. It doesn't mean simply rich folk. It doesn't mean those who own the means of production or whatever else sort of thing. Nor does it simply mean bougie. It doesn't mean, people who like nice stuff or that sort of thing. Bourgeois in this sense just means urban, right? So you might have heard of the 5 boroughs of New York, which I think is the Bronx, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, right? I think I've got that right. The word boroughs is derived from the same word that bourgeois comes out of. Or you might have heard of like a burger, not like, not something that you eat, but it's like an old-timey word that means like townsfolk, or somebody who lives in a city, Another funny one I like is villain. It's like Villein, but you read it as villain, and it just means someone who lives in a town.
Like suburbanite or something like that.
The suburbs as we know it didn't quite exist in that time, but I think of it like a smaller, like a town sort of thing.
The townie in New Zealand now.
Yeah, that might be how we would put it, yeah.
Was this like necessarily industrial? Like was that like?
That was later, yeah.
Oh, okay, so it was like pre-industrial, but just like urban. You kind of say urban, right? Like there was
Are you talking about villain, or are you talking about bourgeois society?
bourgeois society.
Okay, yeah. So bourgeois society is a phenomenon that is peculiar to, it depends how you date it, but, at the earliest, you might say 1400s to 1500s. That's when the first kind of glimpses of it emerge. But really, it's defined by how it takes root later. Centuries later, it really comes into its own as this new, distinctly urban worldview. Which is to say that the worldview of the urban worker begins to usurp and replace the ideology or worldview of those who had defined society previously, which had been those at the top of the caste system. So this was a peculiar and new phenomenon. And it's not simply that just everyone suddenly lived in a city overnight, because they didn't, but rather that through people moving to the cities, they produced a need for cities, and they produced the cities as the centres of commerce and trade. And this is the era that we still live in today. Because prior to that era, everything was defined by subsistence from the countryside and that sort of thing. But for the first time in human history, you had, in some places, the majority of the population moving away. Because prior to that, you had people who would live their entire lives never moving more than 100 kilometres outside of where they were born, but also where their parents were born. Except in cases of, political exile or conquest or migratory, migration due to natural disaster and other causes. But predominantly, the world became bourgeois. And I think I've covered what I've got here from my notes, but what I do really want to cover is the point that society in general, at least in Europe, but increasingly through the 19th century and into the 20th, society across the world, society came to be based on exchange of commodities rather than subsistence. So people produced a surplus and they traded it, and that was the new way of life. And here's where the second quote by Louis Menand, or the second part of the Louis Menand quote, is helpful. So he goes on to describe what life became like in this new era. He says, in modern societies, the ends of life are not given at the beginning of life. They are thought to be created or discovered. The reproduction of the customs and practices of the group is no longer the chief purpose of existence. The idea is not to repeat, but to change, to move the world forward. Meaning is no longer immanent in the practices of ordinary life, since those practices are understood by everyone to be contingent and time-bound. This is why death in modern societies is the great taboo, an absurdity, the worst thing one can imagine. For at the close of life, people cannot look back and know that they have accomplished the task set for them at birth, as was the case in traditional society. This knowledge always lies up ahead, somewhere over history's horizon. So what I want to do at this point is ask if everyone is still with me. Have I lost everyone? Anyone? This has been pretty clear, pretty straightforward.
Very good.
Becoming is a general process that all of life is bound up in. You know that great, what's that classic, is it Heraclitus, who says, no man can step into the same river twice? Yeah, this notion that everything is in flux, right? That would be what becoming used to mean. Whereas, peculiarly, in the modern era, people begin thinking of becoming as transformation and of change, which is a point I'll develop a bit more. But you start seeing that in philosophy as early as Rousseau through to Kant and Hegel. What's known as the Kantian turn which, we don't need to get into if you're not like up on philosophy, it's totally fine. But, he gets that from Rousseau, and Rousseau was like a really huge figure for the Enlightenment, like earth-shatteringly big for how people begin to think of this new modern era. Are we good to go? Okay. That's a good pivot point, because I want to talk about rights really briefly. Rights is a distinctly new phenomenon. So I've already mentioned that the society of modern society, or bourgeois society, is urban, and the way in which I mean it's urban is that it's shaped by the condition of urban workers, who are predominantly traders, as I mentioned, but also craftsmen. And they saw that their new social relation of labour and exchange, i.e. the exchange of commodities, which includes their labour, because labour is a commodity, this new system had undermined the feudal monarchical systems of old, and they began to form value systems that accounted for this shift. You see this reflected in philosophy too, by the way. As I mentioned, there was Rousseau, Kant and Hegel who understood that the dominant characteristic of this new epoch was freedom. But it was a new kind of freedom, distinct from the ancient sort. So earlier on I mentioned Aristotelian freedom, the right to live one's life not being conquered or that sort of thing, or live one's life unimpeded. In bourgeois society, freedom meant the right to change oneself, or to participate in change, or to self-transform either individually or collectively. So I'm going to write this as a significant term on the board. Freedom. Now, everyone's probably heard, although I shouldn't assume, of the three terms of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. That's kind of what this is speaking to. This new kind of freedom that is distinct from the ancient sort, and the right to lift oneself up either as an individual or as a society and change what it means. For the first time in human history, you get this category of the people, right? Certainly there were ideas that had been formulated prior to that about the meaning of the polis, or how the individual related to the collective, to their tribe, to their group, to their civilization, to their order. But never before had the people, or the populace, been thought of as an agent that existed separate from the state and could change the state. Yeah?
Do you think that assumption is predicated on like individuality and sort of the individual becoming or like gaining supremacy over the collective, sort of? It's like individual ideas.
In a certain sense, yeah. In a certain sense, in as far as you've got this new tendency of, this notion of the bourgeois individual, or humanism, which begins to emerge in this era when secularism begins on the rise, which is relevant because we're in rationalist house, which is a tradition that comes out of secularism. But broadly speaking, the reason why it's significant to think about the idea of the individual is, well, it all comes down to Rousseau. We read on our syllabus, by the way, and in the opening pages of on the discourse on the origin of inequality, he talks about how, he kind of takes up as a thought experiment this idea of how did the individual come to form society? Which he doesn't actually literally believe, it's more like a thought experiment sort of thing, but nevertheless it is kind of a way of understanding how people in bourgeois society were trying to conceive of themselves as separate from something else, be that God or the crown, or the church sort of thing. But yeah, it is certainly relevant, so that's really good. What I want to quickly do to hopefully just glue it all together, because I did talk about the word nature in the German sense, is I'll provide the word freedom in the German sense, which is Geist. A way that has been translated.
Spirit or ghost.
Exactly, yeah. So a good way of remembering that is the spirit of the times. So Zeitgeist, we're all familiar with this idea that an ambient idea that just permeates our thoughts and influences all human activity. It's not to be taken as literal as that. That's almost like a metaphysical conception or like a divine kind of conception. Rather, we should just be thinking of freedom broadly as consciousness. Those who are familiar with Hegel will know the phenomenology of spirit that sometimes, or I think kind of in older translations, has been rendered as philosophy of mind or phenomenology of mind. So I hope this is kind of like becoming a little bit clearer. And I've already covered how in this new society freedom meant the possibility of transforming oneself, right? Nietzsche, to borrow one of his terms, calls it Selbstaufhebung. So it's Aufhebung with like self at the start, like self-overcoming, to become something other than what you currently are. And that's really what Marx meant in the passage I quoted earlier when he uses the word becoming. And I'll just quote it again for your benefit. He says, "What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming." So here we've got becoming as opposed to being, where it's to exist not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. And hence why freedom became the rallying cry of the French Revolution. For generations, urban workers were increasingly beginning to demand these bourgeois rights politically. Is everyone here familiar with the bourgeois revolutions? Have you heard of this notion before?
Like
Okay.
post-feudal or
Sorry?
like the post-feudal thing, or?
Yeah, roughly. Or marking the transition, you might call it, between feudal society and bourgeois society. So in the 1500s, you've got the Dutch revolt against the Spanish, which establishes, the first, recognised republic, or there might be Switzerland, I can't remember, but it's significant historically. After that, in the 1600s, you've got the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, which subordinates the king to Parliament. And the 1700s, you've got the American and French revolutions, which really seal the deal on this whole bourgeois thing. Well, not definitively, because there are wars that react against, particularly the French Revolution, that are significant in the next century. But nonetheless, it reframes the question, as it were. And the idea behind all of this stuff, the reason why people revolted and tried to construct these new constitutional republics, these new liberal democratic orders, was that the traders and manufacturers that comprised the majority of people underpinning this new tendency of thought saw political potential in the fact that they produced the modern world. So as opposed to the priestly and warrior castes of old, they saw themselves as this distinct third category that actually produced society. So the Abbé Sieyès, he's like a French guy that produces this famous pamphlet called We Are the Third Estate, that's wildly popular during the French Revolution. And it's basically that idea, like the first and second estates of the clergy, the church, and the aristocracy. They are not who contribute the most to society. It is we, the workers. And by workers demanding the value of their labour, that they produced and reproduced a society based upon it, or at least that was the political aspiration. And they sought to protect their bourgeois values, which included democracy, republicanism, and all the stuff by trying to enshrine it in law. And once again, just to really bang this point home, foremost among these rights was the right to transform oneself. So in the Declaration of Independence during the American Revolution, you've got this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You've also got the notion of freedom of conscience, association, religion. You've got free elections and universal suffrage, and many more various kind of rights that more or less point towards the idea that we can, if not currently, hope or aspire to live in a free society if we lay the groundwork now. Right? If we begin the process, it is hoped that within our lifetimes or within our children's lifetimes, they will live in a free society. This is where things get problematic. This is where things start to take a turn for the worse. And I don't wish to imply at all that everything was rosy during this time, because it wasn't. But with the period roughly between 1750 to 1850, depending on how we date it, you've got the Industrial Revolution. This the rise of new and different labour-saving technology that is able to rapidly transform the economy of bourgeois society. And what we're really starting to look at now is the tail end of this kind of revolutionary period and the earliest kind of decades of Marx's life. Yep.
I think something that you might have glossed over there was you said that the bourgeois moved into these urban centres, but you didn't really clarify why that was. I think something important to consider would be like primitive accumulation, right? Like how the state or these feudal societies actually removed the land from the workers, so they had nothing left to sell but their labour.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And that factors really heavily into the English Civil War, right, and Oliver Cromwell and all that stuff. Yeah, so certainly people had like good reason to move, and it wasn't just like they decided like, all of a sudden I'm going to move somewhere else. Also the production of new markets and expansion of global economy, which was produced by the acquisition of new territories, such as the Americas. So yeah, that is a fantastic point. Thank you, Daniel.
Well, this is what you mean, right? Like that things weren't particularly rosy, but like it definitely took a turn for the worse as industrialization, whatever came up. Yeah.
And that's why I say it's things become. Okay, I don't want to use the word bad because it implies like it's too one-sided. Mm-hmm. But like in as far as we can entertain that notion, we can say that things took on a general bad. Or let's say problematic character, rather than it being particular and specific to each individual case. All kind of problematic aspects of society started to look the same with the rise of industrial capitalism, which really for Marx was capitalism attaining to its concept. It was capitalism coming unto itself with the rise of labour-saving technology, because it meant that people could be unemployed on a mass scale for the first time in human history. Along with the consolidation of capital and the driving down of wages, you had scores of people, multitudes, who were driven to hunger and destitution because they were out of jobs. Whereas before, you did have people that were unable to labour or get the value of their labour because, let's say, of famine or war or natural disaster or that sort of thing. Again, it was specific. It was particular to each individual case and could be judged on that basis, instead of it being like, oh, there's one thing that is making all of this happen. And that was the rise of industrial machinery and the kind of social configurations that came with it. And this produced a new social category called the proletariat. Workers who had previously owned their labour became estranged from it. They faced a reality where they had to divide every day up according to the needs of the so-called dark satanic mills, the giant factories, that haunted kind of the landscapes of, Victorian England, to use one example, but also increasingly across the Western Europe and then eventually the world. And these workers had to increasingly become the custodians of giant faceless machines as well. They couldn't just, feel like they were the responsible agents for their labour. They felt, in fact, subordinate to their ability to labour, and they parcelled up their workday accordingly, which is a point that I want to turn on to kind of illustrate some of this point. So this is a picture of factories, presumably from Victorian England, but it kind of gets the point across. And that, you can already see like the towering smokestacks kind of, polluting the skyways there. And another kind of negative consequence of this turn is class conflict and civil war and revolutions, right? So this is a painting by Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, which depicts the July revolution, abortive revolution of 1830. And in many cases, all cases, they failed, and they were put down and suppressed, resulting in untold bloodshed. In addition to these, you saw mass migration, you saw human-caused famine and ecological disaster, wars of imperial conquest, and monopolies, especially as the late 19th century proceeded, which are points I probably don't need to go into because we all take it for granted that this is what has been wrought. Yep.
So just to clarify, you said the ownership of labour is taken from the bourgeois class before the capitalism did its thing, and the reason that is because there's planned like the structural unemployment. So the cost of labour is driven down because there's there's actually a structural unemployment built into the system.
More or less, yeah. To say that it is built into the system implies a certain agency, which I do need to underscore, isn't necessarily thought out deliberately or consciously by anyone.
Certainly in our neoliberal society,
we've developed the machinery, sure. Yeah.
4% unemployment is usually what
we figured out how to manage the condition of mass unemployment in such a way as to keep enough of it going without completely destroying our society. But yeah, definitely in that time it was, you might call it more of an organic process, but one way or the other it led to what we have now.
Right.
Now, to describe this general new condition, I want to turn to the final quote, which is by the director of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, Max Horkheimer. He's like a cultural critic who lived in the early part of the 20th century, and he was responsible for trying to figure out what went wrong with this term in history and what it meant for Marxism. And he puts it as follows. He says, "The historical predictions on the fate of bourgeois society have been confirmed. In the system of the free market economy, which pushed men to labour-saving discoveries and finally subsumed them in a global mathematical formula, its specific offspring, machines, have become means of destruction, not merely in the literal sense. They have made not work, but the workers superfluous." Right? So remember that bit from the first quote we looked at from Marx, from the Grundrisse, where he's like, what is, how do we evaluate modernity and how, I'm just trying to find the exact quote. Where he basically talks about how, hold on, let me just find it. He says, the ancient conception in which man always appears as the aim of production seems very much more exalted than the modern world in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production, where humanity is only a means to an end for something else. Like humanity is not an end in its own right. It doesn't produce a new and different way of understanding itself in line with its kind of its time. So in this sense, what's helpful to remember is like remembering our categories between past and present, or ancient and modern. This ancient sense of freedom, this Aristotelian freedom, to just live one's life unimpeded, that can't be sanctified. It can't be taken up or valorized as something to be championed, because it wouldn't be possible in a society where everything is constantly in flux and changing and transforming itself. And the reason why I say this society is transforming itself is because that's exactly what capitalism is doing. With every cycle of boom and bust, with every war, with every wave of inflation that hits, that sort of thing, capitalism discovers new ways to manage its discontents. And sometimes that involves the working class, by the way. Sometimes it involves, people who consider themselves left-wing or don't, but would fit into that category otherwise, who call for law and order and that sort of thing, or who support wars. The German SPD, the kind of largest social democratic, what was then, it was called Social Democratic, but it was basically, like a socialist organisation, voted for war credits, which inaugurated World War I, and that's what enabled that whole thing to happen. Yeah.
It's sort of something makes me think of. I remember when I was watching some interview with Noam Chomsky. He was talking about the American Civil War, and it's interesting because that war was fundamentally about like two economic systems, right? It's either the like labor is sold, or labor is like not to say that slavery is a moral or a just system or anything like that, because it's not.
Sure.
But
which is bourgeois morality, by the way. I should point out that it's that the kind of moral framework we apply to thinking about slavery as opposed to like free labor comes from this kind of bourgeois tradition that we all take for granted today. Yeah.
Would you say that? I mean, I think I would argue that a bourgeois person is, well, at least in the case of American Deep South, like slavery, plantation type of ownership. Certainly, the bourgeois in that case are more free than the slaves are.
Sure, it's definitely relative. Yeah, don't get me wrong. When I talk about morality in this sense, I just mean that what's underpinning the notion that all people should be free and that no one should be slaves is predicated on this kind of historical emergence of a society where people could be free, which gives us the idea of universal suffrage, that everyone should be able to vote, that no one should be enslaved, the abolition movement, all of this stuff comes from this bourgeois turn originally. And the reason why I say that is I'm just trying to shine a light on the emancipatory promise of the bourgeois revolutions that seems to contradict themselves eventually, or at least to later generations once you've got the Industrial Revolution intervening. Does that make sense? Yeah. Great. I went on a tangent, I'm just trying to remember where I was. So I read the Max Horkheimer quote, and what that's really trying to express is the idea of bourgeois society in crisis. So I used the word self-contradictory before, the idea that bourgeois society, with all of its promises and emancipatory ideals, is somehow coming into conflict with itself. It's unable to realise its own potential. This is what we call a crisis. And when I say crisis, I mean it specifically, meaning it comes from the Greek word crisis, which in that sense implies, I think it has medical connotation, and it means a turning point, basically, like an unresolved transition. So if you're looking at an illness, if you're performing a pathology, if you're a physician, you might be like, this illness is in crisis, where is it going to go? It can either get better or it can get worse, but nonetheless, we have to treat it. And for bourgeois society to be in crisis, it means that it is rapidly unfolding and that something needs to be done about it, but nevertheless something will be done about it one way or another, no matter who takes the reins. And so Marx understood the Industrial Revolution as an expression of bourgeois society coming into crisis or coming into contradiction with itself. And this is really important. The Industrial Revolution outstripped, undermined, and threatened to destroy the social relations set up under bourgeois society. So any promise, any aspirations that seemed emancipatory and seemed universalist, because there was a lot of talk about universalism and, universal rights, spreading freedom across the world and all that sort of stuff. We didn't hear those words and maybe cringe the same way we might now, Like when you hear a nation like the USA say, we're spreading freedom, you might cast aspersions, you might look sideways at that kind of phrase and be like, well, what are they really trying to spread, sort of thing. It didn't necessarily always have that sheen, necessarily. Or if it did, it was particular, not general.
And maybe also the delivery of that wasn't through a state, but through the people in the state, right?
That's very good. That is exactly right. The role of the state to mediate the discontents of society only really comes to bear with the kind of failed revolutions of 1848, or at least it achieves its fullest expression with this phenomenon known as Bonapartism. So the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte crowns himself emperor and kind of repeats many of the stuff his uncle did, but he's like a utopian socialist guy, and he recruits all these utopian socialists, but then he goes and kind of stabs a lot of the socialist movement in the back, and you see that recurring in various patterns throughout history. But that's a discussion for another teaching. Sorry.
I was going to say that there's a book called Black Shirts and Reds, and it talks about how Mussolini, he was originally a socialist.
Yeah, fascism came out of socialism, it did.
And then he sold out. He sold his morals, basically, and because obviously fascism is always supported by the upper class, bourgeois, wealthy, who want to destroy communism.
Sure. Well, fascism is a way of liquidating the kind of revolutionary potential of the working class movement for socialism to the state, of handing it over to the state. And you start to see this more and more in the 20th century. Yeah, so that's great. So I will read the rest of the Horkheimer quote. Is everyone okay with that? Because it is a longer one, but you're doing a great job at staying with me. Okay, I hope I'm not being too abstract or going too fast or anything like that. No?
It's perfect.
Okay. So what is a theory of crisis? What does that mean? Critical theory. How do we measure this distance, this gulf between intellectual theory and political practice? Well, Horkheimer says, in socialism, freedom, Geist, spirit, consciousness, is to become a reality. But because the present system is called free and considered liberal, it is not terribly clear what this may mean. Yet anyone who keeps his eyes open and has a little money in his pocket actually has ample occasion to familiarise himself with this concept. He may, for example, ask an acquaintance for a job in his firm. That has nothing to do with philosophy. But his acquaintance knits his brow and says that is objectively impossible. Business is bad, he says, and he's even been obliged to let many employees go. The man should not be angry with him, for it is not within his power. His freedom doesn't extend that far. The businessman is subject to laws which neither he nor anyone else nor any power with such a mandate created with purpose and deliberation. They are laws which the big capitalists and perhaps he himself skillfully make use of, but whose existence must be accepted as a fact. Boom, bust, inflation, wars, and even the qualities of things and human beings the present society demands are a function of such laws, of the anonymous social reality, just as the rotation of the earth expresses the laws of dead nature. No single individual can do anything about them. But in actuality, all those phenomena which are either experienced as accidental or given a mystical interpretation depend on men and the way they arrange their social existence. They can therefore also be changed. What today appears as a fact of nature in the private and business dealings of individuals are the effects of social life as a whole. They are human, not divine products. Because these effects of life in society are present, but not conscious, willed, or controlled, and are the results of an equal number of individual wills that grasp neither their dependence nor their power, the limitation on individual freedom in our time is immeasurably greater than would be necessary given the available means. And with your permission, I'll continue. Only 4 more paragraphs. When the businessman whom his acquaintance asks for a job refuses because conditions...
There's no more.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't put the whole quote there. I apologise. Just try and soak it in, if you can. I struggle because I have to read while I'm listening, so, in your position I'd be screwed, but I hope that you're all much more cognitively able than I am. Okay, when the businessman whom his acquaintance asks for a job refuses because conditions don't permit it, he thinks he is referring to something purely objective and totally autonomous, reality itself. Men must submit to conditions they themselves constantly create as to something alien and overwhelmingly powerful. Of course, the present lack of freedom does not apply equally to all. An element of freedom exists when the product is consonant with the interest of the producer. So there he's talking about the idea that freedom is unevenly distributed. Does that make sense? Some people who are represented by their interests are represented by the production of what goes on, let's say in the factory or whatever, who see a return on what they produce, I might say, are entitled to, or they experience more freedom. All those who work, and even those who don't, have a share in the creation of contemporary reality, but the degree of that consonance varies considerably. Those for whom it is high seem responsible for reality in a sense. They speak of our reality as if they were royalty, and rightly so. For although they did not themselves create the world, one cannot but suspect that they would have made it exactly as it is. It suits them perfectly that the production and preservation of reality in our society proceed blindly. But for the little man who is turned down when he asks for a job because objective conditions make it impossible, it is most important that their origin be brought to the light of day so that they do not continue being unfavourable to him. Not only his own lack of freedom, but that of others as well, spells his doom. His interest lies in the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom. And the reason why it's important to underscore this point is because it might be easy for us to be led down a certain path when we're reading this kind of whole relationship between the person who asks his friend for a job in the firm and the friend who's representative of the petty bourgeoisie or middle class or whatever else can't give him a job and that sort of thing. It's easy to just misread that as the capitalists are greedy and bad and they're rich dumb people who are just entitled, they have all the freedom and it relates to their interests, and we're the oppressed, subaltern, the exploited class and that sort of thing. No. What Horkheimer is really trying to address here is the idea of society under domination. When a society is at odds with itself, such as that which we see in the modern bourgeois era, we see a society in crisis and contradiction, a society that is dominated by the principles which it itself has created through its people. So when Horkheimer says the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom, to address that, I want to talk about the difference between exploitation or oppression and domination. So although exploitation existed in the bourgeois era, as we kind of already talked about a little bit, and has always existed, it was only with the Industrial Revolution did society begin to experience its domination generally. And what was this domination? So unlike previous eras, it wasn't just one group oppressing another, so much as all of society dominated by capital. The way to put this, that's kind of like a handy, convenient way to put it, is capitalism, not capitalistism. Because if you have a capitalist who's not very good at managing their money, they stop being a capitalist. I mean, we might think of them like, we might label them as such, even if they're like end up on the street or whatever, but they cease to continue to the growth of capital in society, right? Whereas in so-called ancient society, a member of the aristocracy, will always be a member of the aristocracy, sort of thing. Just to use one example. And for the worker under capitalism, it's someone who, instead of producing an enriched existence as the aim of production, as Marx was kind of getting at, they now merely exist as the means to the end of producing capital. So capital here is, the added value that's necessary to reinvest money in the production process so as to expand it, which requires buying new machines, but also by decreasing costs, including wages, so the cost of labour, and that requires people to compete for work, creating unemployment. And this condition is not just a condition of the proletariat, but it defines all of society, defines all social experience. Do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I was just, when you were talking about the lack of the freedom in that interpersonal relation, asking a friend for a job. So, just so I'm trying to keep up with this, so this would be to suggest then that the friend unable to provide you that position is unfree in a real way, that their choices are bounded by how they're beholden to capital in that way. Or
Right. So the question was, how is freedom, how exactly is it unevenly distributed if the general condition of society is unfree, like being dominated by capital? Was that?
Well, yeah. Or is the capitalist in this instance, are they part of being dominated? Are they being dominated in the relation that you're talking about?
Well, it's a relative term for sure. Like certainly the relationship between capitalist and the labourer, you would call that exploitation. Like that is definitely what is going on. But generally, the condition which motivates this entire process to begin with is the domination of society by capital, right? And society here refers to, like it is a peculiar concept that comes out of the Enlightenment and out of bourgeois society. And I know we take a term like society for granted. We're just like, oh, people have always talked about society. Oh, what is society? But like, actually it became an object of critique. And like, what is, like I was mentioning the Abbé Sieyès pamphlet, We Are the Third Estate. It's like, we are society, and how do we manage our own affairs? How do we transform ourselves? How do we actualize ourselves? How do we move out of that which is given or available to us? How does becoming emerge out of being? All these notions of freedom start, arising, and capitalism appears to throw all that into crisis. It appears to make it unrealizable. So everything has the appearance, as we might say. Daniel?
I would agree.
Okay, sweet. I'll move us along, and I don't think we've got much more to go. Basically, the idea is that the society of this epoch, the epoch of capital, produces us, and so too do we contribute to it. We reproduce that very historical condition through all activity we participate in, If you understand activity here as like kind of a more abstract way of saying labour, the way that we labour as mediated by exchange, by it being commodified, informs all social reality. And when I say that, I don't mean that like every single thing we do has a price tag on it, because that's like secondary, that's not as important as the idea that it could have a price tag attached to it. It could foreseeably be put on the market in some way, whatever we do. Capitalism has proven itself very robust and very adept at transforming itself. That's why Lukács, this 20th century, German intellectual critic, Marxist, talks about the commodity form as the most fundamental principle of life under capitalism. So even if you're unemployed, your labour could have a price tag attached to it. And here, this is relevant to all of us because it implies that history is a subjective phenomenon as well as an objective one. History here meaning not literally what people write in books, but just all human activity through time. It is subjective as well as objective. And this captures why Marx appears ambivalent in the opening quote about the failing promise of bourgeois society. That's why he doesn't just appear to affirm ancient versus modern or modern. He instead is this appears to be unstable and something needs to be done about it. Yep.
Can you clarify how you went from that everything has the potential to be commodified to history is subjective, but that kind of...
Yeah, I get you. That does appear like a leap. I guess what I was trying to express was that all human activity can be commodified, right? And as far as all human activity is a form of labour, or can be thought of it as a kind of labour, and as far as it's productive. And so does all human activity, or so can all human activity through time be regarded as a historical process. All history is a social relation, basically, right? And when you think of something as a social relation, you think of it as something that is constructed, that is made by humans, and so they can change it, which also pops up in the Marx quote we started with today. And as soon as you understand that humans create their conditions, you can then think about the ways in which they might change those conditions. And that's why I say it's subjective, right? And the commodification of labour is bound up in all of that. Does that kind of adequately circle around the question in a more clear way?
Sort of, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully, as we round up the presentation, some of these questions will begin to solidify. Yep.
So you'd say the day-to-day production and reproduction of capital and stuff would be it's more compared to ancients and stuff as Marx make it has become more subjectively grounded in subjective dimensions of our lives perhaps because exploitation happens on a more individualized level. Could you say, or would that be too reductive from ancient to modern?
Can you reformulate the question?
I don't know. I'm just referring back to the whole things have become more subjective as commodification intensifies thing. Is that you can say it's the trajectory away from ancient towards modern, whereby ancient back then there had to be set things you were born into, that kind of thing.
In a certain sense, I mean, I don't want to overstate how things are subjective necessarily, because of course we've always had subjectivity and we've always related to ourselves individually and as a collective, but there is a peculiar spin on it that I suppose begins to take root in bourgeois society, wherein it really comes down to this idea of freedom as self-transformation. People begin to understand freedom as they're trying to understand the conditions of possibility for change generally. They're how did things suddenly look so different versus our parents and our grandparents' generation, where they were living in this system where everyone lived in the countryside and everyone subsisted on their seasonal harvest and gave the rest to their local lord or whoever else. And why do we all of a sudden have a constitutional republican order, and by that measure you might say that the subjective began to factor more heavily in the political activity of its historical actors, but it didn't quite have the same urgency as with the rise of the proletariat and the Industrial Revolution, because the stakes were, people lived and died during the Bourgeois Revolution, so let's not, gloss over that. But there was an urgent need to realise the tasks set forth by the Bourgeois Revolution with these kind of abortive revolutions that took place during Karl Marx's lifetime, like the revolution of 1830, liberty leading the people, or 1848, which was these revolutions which swept Europe but were violently put down. And more recently as well, 1917 would be the classic example of a revolution that's trying to live up to the promise of the bourgeois revolution. The main point though is that when we think about history as a subjectively occurring phenomenon, not just like a metaphysical, static thing that occurs outside of us, there's something sublime about it in the sense that it appears terrifying, but also promising. We are historical agents, but we are also responsible. We are also bound up in this general crisis, which is objective and collective, but also individual and subjective. We experience in ourselves, subjectively, the crisis that is afflicting the whole, that is afflicting the totality, right? All of society's discontents find their expression in each of our individual actions. Not uniformly, necessarily, and not to every single individual person, but generally that the tendency is there. And Marx is trying to take that up. He's trying to look at all the symptoms, we might call it, in this broad pathology of human civilization, and trying to recognise the hidden potentialities of freedom in that, and trying to recognise the specific potentialities of freedom in capitalism. So why does any of this matter? Well, Marxism once thought of capitalism as transitional. Marx in his lifetime, that is, thought of capitalism as transitional. And capitalism cannot transcend itself. It can only reconfigure itself. Capitalism is very revolutionary. It's very adept at that, as I mentioned. But by the proletariat realising itself, which is to say, reflecting on the necessity of its appearance in history, it can recognise how capitalism points beyond itself to further freedom and realise that task, which can only come with capitalism being done away with. I guess what it makes me think of is there being a surplus population. I'm reading the idea of man being created, I'm reading that very literally, but people are created, babies are born to serve capitalism, in as far as you have a population of people who are out of work, and that keeps the cost of labour low because people are competing on the workplace, on the marketplace, for jobs, basically. I don't know if that's the sense you meant it though. Did you mean something else?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So you didn't really touch on the significance.
That's right.
You didn't touch on the significance of the state, I don't think, unless you did.
Not really. No. So the state becomes important. I did during the Q&A before, but basically the state becomes important with the rise of this crisis of society becoming apparent and manifesting itself in social discontents, including civil unrest. Right? So these abortive revolutions during the 19th century I mentioned, 1848, 1830, and other ones as well, begin to necessitate the role of the state to manage this crisis of capitalism. And crucially, the state gets taken up as the arm and leg of the capitalists, lobby groups, or media funded by capital is somehow propping up regimes, and that might be true on an individual basis, but generally speaking, capitalism, or I said the wrong word, the state exists to serve neither the capitalists nor the proletariat. It exists to manage the crises that are afflicted by capitalism, which I guess de facto does serve the interests of the capitalists, but in an indirect way. Yeah.
It's also almost all our current notions of states and the role of states come from that bourgeois society, right? Like our idea of, especially like in the law, right? Our idea of rights and property all comes from this individualist idea of freedom and like enshrining certain freedoms, and you have a certain degree of your rights in relation to the person next to you, and your rights in relation to the state are all like fundamentally based on like a bourgeois morality.
Yeah,
right?
and that's great. That's really, really crucial, because with the rise of bourgeois institutions generally under civil society, under bourgeois society, the role of the apparatus of the state, which we should be historically precise here and clarify that it wasn't nearly as bureaucratic and sprawling as we understand it to be today. But in terms of its function and its purpose, it was to guarantee the enshrinement of bourgeois right and law, and to protect this idea of freedom, equality, and liberty. So that's why I brought up the example of the American Constitution, the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The reason why we are skeptical about that today, and we look at a document like the Constitution and be like, it's all well and good to say that on paper, but clearly, America just, screws over the little guy and that sort of thing, and it has done for centuries. It's like, yeah, sure. Only if we take into account how history has intervened and the developments of, for instance, the Industrial Revolution, which occurred after the time of the penning of the Constitution. And if we look at the idea of how the discontents of society, which erupted in conflict between classes and that sort of thing, began to, they failed to take the careening car driving off the motorway, it failed to take the wheel, as it were, and steer it towards socialism. So it is easy to cast a certain image backwards upon that time, if that makes sense. Are we good?
Would you say that the state fundamentally seeks to sort of preserve itself before anything, before capitalists or before any other class? The state. Do you think the state exists to perpetuate itself, or is it more first in service of?
Well, I mean, what is fascism?
Yeah. What
is fascism but a way of like the state, growing into a certain way of being with its bureaucratic appendages reaching into every aspect of civil society, where it attempts to do away with any kind of organic form of people trying to represent their own interests, if that makes sense. I'm thinking here when I say that of this piece by Herbert Marcuse, who we recently read on one of our syllabuses on the meaning of Marxism and politics, who talks about liberalism as really planting the seeds for what came in fascism. And liberalism is a tricky term because it means something different in the time of like the bourgeois revolutionaries as it does, coming into the late 19th century. And when we think of liberals today, we have a very peculiar understanding of the term that doesn't necessarily speak for the whole. But nevertheless, to speak to your point, I would say that certainly the state grows and creates new and innovative ways of managing the crisis of society. Yeah. It involves various qualitative transformations, definitely.
What do you mean by that, qualitative transformations?
Well, I mean, this idea of the modern era, this modern era as being principally undergirded by self-transformation. It sounds very optimistic to be like, freedom, everything is, we're all changing and transforming. It should be read more ambivalently than that. It's like we have the capacity to change ourselves for the better, both individually and collective, and yet we don't, Rousseau's got this famous line, man is born free but is everywhere in chains. That's what he's actually trying to address. He's trying to address this idea that, it appears from the vantage point of the present, of bourgeois society, as though we're all equal, we're all free and that sort of thing, but something is stopping us. And Rousseau's ambivalent about that. He's been like, well, freedom or like the possibility of realizing freedom appears to be located in the future, but why aren't we, attaining to that, if that makes sense? And which speaks also to why Marxism thought of capitalism as transitional, as one stage towards socialism. So capitalism can't be simply countered or opposed from without, like it's an external agency, but it has to be taken up, it has to be realized and preserved and negated all at the same time. In as far as capitalism brought us the conditions for universal freedom that we see, but only as a speculative proposition, only for something that lies in the future, but which is currently being undermined and being outstripped and being threatened to be destroyed by capitalism. And this is why Marx reasoned that the only way for society to realise the unfulfilled promise of the bourgeois era was for the proletariat to do away with the necessity of there being a proletariat in the first place, and to realise this demand politically. So whereas the abolition of the other classes would only reconstitute society and kind of give just like a regime change, the abolition of the proletariat would necessarily mean society transforming itself. And if you want a helpful way of thinking about all this stuff, because we've covered a lot of ground tonight, and I thank you for staying with me. A helpful way of thinking about it is that classical Marxism didn't think of capitalism as fundamentally good or bad, like a moral category, because that would be kind of transhistorical. It would kind of be just like treating like any other movement in, or like social configuration in history, but rather that capitalism had not been realized in as far as it made people suffer. Which is not the same as Marxism saying that we need to take capitalism, like we need to be more capitalist or something, like definitely not. That's definitely not what he's saying. But simply that it represented a constant self-undermining of its own potential. This is what's called a dialectical immanent critique, by the way, like an internal kind of dialectical kind of mode of understanding. And if you want a metaphor that makes this useful, to continue this kind of pathology sort of thing I've been on tonight, Nietzsche thinks of this general condition of crisis as like a kind of suffering. But when we think of capitalism as suffering, we might think of it as a morning sickness in the first trimester of bourgeois society's pregnancy. So it points beyond itself and it offers its own self-overcoming to something better, potentially. But, something needs to be done about it, obviously. And thus, from all this, a crisis of society points beyond itself to a further freedom. But the point here, and if there's one thing that I want you to go away and think about, is that it needs to be diagnosed as such in order to be treated. Like a pathology needs to be performed on the crisis of the present in order for us to know what the hell to do next. Right? And to round out the discussion, this is really what Platypus's aim is as an organisation. We try and perform a pathology of this potential transformation by looking at the present moment, by looking at the left, by being like, what do people take for granted? What are our preconceptions? What do people understand? And if our current society is defined by conditions which point towards freedom in self-transformation, how is society as we currently know it falling short of that potentiality? And one way it falls short is in the loss of historical consciousness of the problem generally, which amounts to a liquidation of the aims of Marxism. Marx is a critic of the left, which he was. And when I say critic, I don't mean like, he denounced the left, although, in his private letters he could be kind of spicy, apparently. Rather, it just simply means trying to understand or excavate the conditions of possibility for self-transformation, for freedom, for consciousness, for spirit, for Geist, for becoming, all this stuff. Right, trying to understand how things change. That's what critique means in this tradition of critical philosophy, which you get from Rousseau to Kant to Hegel, all these thinkers that informed Marx's approach. So rather than just being a philosopher or social theorist of that which currently is, and this is useful for me to like kind of round everything out, instead of, I gotta get this off, instead of Marx just trying to simply understand what is, Marx is trying to understand what ought to be, the political. So he's not a static, he's not like a theorist or a methodologist of that which is static and unmoving. He's trying to understand how things change how things are dynamic, how they transform themselves. Because that is imminent to modern society, in Marx's view. I guess the idea that I'll close with is just the idea that with a dialectical immanent approach, critical approach, it's important to recognise that oneself is bound up in this crisis as well. So of course, Platypus regards itself as a symptom, just as much as it regards the left as a symptom. And once again, symptom here doesn't necessarily mean a deadly disease or pathogen, but it could be. And it certainly looks that way. So that's what we're trying to generally figure out, and we need history in order to uncover that. Or else we're prone to regression, failure and defeat on the left, which it seems that we've been facing for at least 100 years. And that's why we get a general condition where people take it for granted that revolution is impossible in our lifetimes or the near future. And I'm not saying that it is either, but it is a serious question that needs to be thought about, which doesn't give us any answers, I know, and that might be disappointing to some, but it is a gravely serious question, and it's this task that Platypus is attempting to recover, and this is why our founding motto is, the left is dead, long live the left. Yeah, so that's like all I've really got. We've done a pretty good job at like kind of peppering the Q&A like into the discussion, so I'm fine with that if you are, but if anyone does want to ask any questions, now is a great time, or we can chat afterwards, totally up to you. And a lot of this material is in our yearly syllabus, so you'll get the benefit of attending that once it starts in 3 weeks if you want to learn more and really internalise these ideas that come from classical Marxism. Yeah?
Maybe around about 2 paragraphs before you finished, you asked if we are not attaining this idea of freedom, this one idea of freedom. I think you said, why? Did you ask something along those lines?
I think I would have, yeah.
I wonder if that is, this discussion seems to come back to this, for me, to this idea of freedom as to be discovered, and that by virtue of that, it is always, there's this quote, what is it? Menard's quote, his second quote about at death, we can't look back and know if we've accomplished this freedom. Is that what he's saying? We can't know. So is the question, I don't understand how the problem of not attaining this freedom, I don't understand how that's not built into the concept of freedom that we've been talking about today.
Right. So when you say the problem of not attaining to this freedom, you're talking about the idea of freedom not being realised, right? Are you talking about bourgeois society in crisis with itself, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Bourgeois coming into this contradiction that it calls itself free.
Yeah.
But it has to continue with.
Yeah.
It's not.
But you don't see how that is not itself built into the idea of freedom generally, underpinning the entire, the paradigm is one of freedom, right? That persists nevertheless, even though it's not being realised. Is that what you're saying?
Are you saying that that's paradoxical?
I guess I'm saying that the crisis of the bourgeoisie seems inevitable.
Right.
By the way, that we've discussed.
Right. The crisis of bourgeois society seems inevitable when bourgeois society itself is founded on this precept of freedom in self-transformation as realisable.
Yeah.
Well, let me attempt an answer, and once again, let me know if this speaks to what you're addressing or not. When we talk about the is and the ought, we talk about that which is given, that which is the same, unchanging, this German sense of the word nature or being, right? Everything that currently is, you might call it, understand it as the status quo. And we read a text on our syllabus by this social critic Marxist guy called Lev Kolakowski, and he's trying to ask the question of what is the left, or what is the concept of the left? What concept is the left trying to attain to? And he's addressing specifically like fractures within his own party at the time, but this is really getting at our question, because it's like, well, what does the left do? And the left is trying to take up the modern task of freedom and make it attain to its concept. So whereas we live in a society predicated on this notion of freedom, but yet which is unable to realize it.
Freedom as transformation.
Yeah, as the prospect of taking up our general situation consciously and moving it in a transformative direction, i.e. socialism, working class movement socialism. Socialism is trying to realize that, but speculatively, which means as a possibility or a potentiality which lies ahead of us. It isn't present. It isn't necessarily the current state we are. And so Kolakowski's got this great quote where he's like, to destroy a house is just as constructive as to build one, because it necessitates changing the status quo, demolishing the given order so that you can start fresh, sort of thing. And it's being a bit rhetorical, sure, but it does lend itself to this idea of freedom as something which does not yet exist but needs to be realised in order to attain to itself. I mean, once we have socialism, once we have like a revolution that offers the potentiality of a new form of society, well, maybe all these categories will be done away with. Maybe we'll have a whole new way of thinking about ourselves and our society. It's simply something that is unimaginable to us, given that we are born into and conditioned by capitalism, which should be understood as bourgeois society, like bourgeois society in crisis. We have bourgeois values, we have bourgeois morality, everything that we inherit universally, regardless of your socioeconomic kind of status, whether you're working class or, like the 1% or whatever else. The paradigm into which you're born is bourgeois, in the sense that Marx means it, but it is in conflict or in crisis with itself, and is being undermined. So we can only recognise freedom as a potential, not as something that is attainable in the here and now. Whereas, one final thought, in the time of the bourgeois revolutions, it appears as though freedom is just around the corner. Or like relatively soon. It appears like freedom is attainable, but under capitalism, it's a lot more, like it's a lot harder to make that call.
Is your concern that freedom, as you put it, as transformation, is inherently contradictory because it must always be in flux and moving? Or is it because the way I'm thinking of this idea of freedom is that it's the potential for self-transformation, not inherently self-transformative all the time? Like it's only the potential for it to be that, right?
Yeah, I'm understanding freedom is the potential for self-transformation.
I'll also clarify that freedom in the sense emerges from the same or the given. Freedom emerges from what is, right? And I might have confused matters a little bit by like putting ancient and modern at the top, because it makes us think that like, oh, now that we're modern, we no longer have being, we no longer have nature, we no longer have the is. That's, I think it's a bit more fluid than that. Like I might put a line here to signify that like, this was the general tendency of ancient society, but modern society was like the paradigm which generally gives shape to the way that we think about the present is the idea of our potential becoming, of this notion of progress, right? When we judge history, we judge it as a procession of one thing after the another that gradually gets better. Even if we think that like, mistakes happened in the past, we think that they happen so that they can inform and educate those who live in the now, sort of thing. And I'm not advocating for that, by the way, nor am I advocating against it, but just that is the general condition that informs how we regard ourselves. Life is not a cycle, it is linear. if that makes sense. Daniel?
Yeah, I really wanted to just to like tie everything together. Like first of all, like the emphasis we've had on progress has been really, really, really like impressive and important, because you hear things on Marx all the time, but they'll try and give Marx as something static and universalist, that he is this, he is that, and whatever. And obviously that throws his progression, his growth, his work, the system itself completely out the window. But something really, really cool I think we also did here was like emphasizing like this mutual constitution between being and like, you know, we're not in becoming because we've left being, but rather like this like Aufheben, you know, like sublation thing whereby being is preserved. It's like the foundation upon which becoming and all these things can be, you know, built upon. We haven't lost the freedom. Like, we've moved past the freedom of the 18th century, of the 17th century and stuff. But this line of movement, it's so integrative, like, you know, everything is being built from something before, and that, you know, that allows you to give this perfect thing where you say that we right now are creating our material conditions, we right now are creating the present, thereby we have the power to also change the present. But like the way that, you know, progress, and especially like the whole dialectic, mutual constitution, immanent, whatever thing, like makes this so readily available, I think is really impressive. And I think maybe it's a platypus thing or something, where you guys have been doing it for a while. But we have courses on Marx, like at UOA and stuff, and for a whole course, you still don't even get to the gist of this sometimes.
Marx tends to be taught in like one of a few ways, and the ways that he gets taught tend to follow whatever like waves of thought are in currency at the time, like responding to, like, it might be geopolitical crises, for instance, or the idea of like Das Kapital reading groups, the whole notion that like Capital by Marx, this giant tome, is like the first text you need to go to. That's like a relatively recent phenomenon, you know. It largely started in the New Left, but it's really kind of accelerated. I mean, you know, someone older than me might have a different perspective, but like it seems that Occupy has really steeled that notion, that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't read Das Kapital, it's all important, but certainly he gets taught today as a muckraker, you know. Do you guys know what a muckraker is? It's like an old-timey expression that refers to journalists who they're like investigative reporters, like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. This, you know, it's a fictional work based on his real experiences going into like these Chicago factories responsible for producing, I think it was like meatworks, and he'd talk about how terrible the conditions the workers had, and like all the terrible food that, you know, like rats had crawled into that people were eating and stuff like that. This idea of just like exposing something. But Marx isn't actually doing that. He was a journalist, and there was definitely part of like what he was invested in. He did have a human kind of like investment in the whole kind of thing, but it does Marx a disservice to paint him as that one-sidedly. But the point is not simply like, oh, here's what's wrong and here's what's right about the way Marx is taught. The point is that every generation is liable to misteach Marx.
Well, I wouldn't say misteach is the right word. I think there's many different readings, right? Like everyone has their own interpretation of something.
Yes.
Objective.
But the provocative point I wish to push on that is that the idea of, I don't know if perspectivism is the right word, or the idea that, like, you know, there are different readings and we can all come to different understandings, is itself a byproduct of one of these kind of waves of history that we emerge. In particular, this would be called postmodernism. Now, I don't wish to ascribe that purely to where you're coming from, because I certainly agree, and I think it is definitely true that we can read a text in a variety of different ways.
So, certainly,
but we have to understand what mediates the way we read. That is the crucial thing, right? Does it make sense?
Mediates as in...
Well, mediates as in like what comes between that which informs our a priori, or like our preconceptions, what informs it, and the argument of Platypus as a mode of investigation would be that history intervenes, that history comes between, and what we take for granted in our time might not be what another generation took for granted in its time. It might not be night and day, you know, it might very well be gradual, but consciousness does shift, and it isn't necessarily for the better. Because that would be to buy into this ideological notion of progress, and that, you know, like, we don't need to read anyone from the past because they were all wrong, and, you know, we're right, go us, you know. Not to be facetious, I don't mean to be dismissive either of those who hold that perspective, but nevertheless I wish to like just raise it to a higher level of consciousness in the room.
I just looked, unfortunately they've gone, so I wanted to see some clarity on what they were saying, but my kind of interpretation of that, what they were suggesting is that this sort of post-modern, kind of like Francis Fukuyama vibe that we find ourselves in is like
End of history, yeah?
Is a new ancient, right? Like it's a new nature that carries with it its own kind of set of immutable assumptions that we're born into and that we shape ourselves to rather than aiming to transform. And in that way, our current mental cosmology is more fundamentally ancient than, say, Marx's. You know.
Well,
I wish I. That's kind of what I thought they were getting at.
It implies the idea of regression, which is really important to a lot of the texts we read on the syllabus. Like what happens to the idea of Marxism as a revolutionary, way of thinking when revolution has seemingly failed, and how does thinking begin to, rather than negate and defy and transform reality, how does it begin to accommodate itself to reality, right? And it happens gradually. History happens behind our backs, to quote Hegel. The owl of Minerva only flies at dusk is, the famous passage in which he kind of gets that point across. But generally speaking, the idea would be that I can't remember what I was going to say, but remind me what thread we were on? We're talking about that question.
We're talking about how, I guess, the modern historical, our present historical moment, postmodern, I guess, is ancient and in a way that Marx would understand in this sort of framework that you've painted. That
Sure.
Existence is perhaps more ancient than...
Well, the way to put it wouldn't be ancient necessarily because that's, simply chronological, but I get what you mean in the sense that it reaffirms the status quo. The word for this would be what Georgi Lukács calls reification. The idea of making every particular element of the universal appear like self-contained and autonomous, or the idea of making appearances appear as though they're not produced by humans. They just are like metaphysical, abstract entities that pervade everything. So great examples of this, the people, society, history, all these terms that we think people have always talked about and have always just like debated over since time immemorial. And in a certain sense they have, but the meaning is drastically different. Right? The whole idea of public versus private didn't really exist in even ancient like Athenian democracy the same way that we have it now. Democracy meant something radically different in the ancient kind of world, or republics. Modern republicanism is radically different from ancient republicanism. Daniel?
Yeah, could you say like reification, like because capitalism is constantly becoming, and this is like progress aspect, it must become what it's not and whatever, and like could you say like reification is that like that attempt, right, to obfuscate the sheer becomingness of capitalism? Like even I thought it was really provocative. You said that even readings of Marx themselves are reified, that we treat readings of Marx as if they've just always been the same and stuff. Yeah. It's like this like treatment of like like the static, non-dynamic treatment of things, right? Which like prevents historical materialism, prevents artistic materialism, prevents this like being able to actually engage in things as if they're changing and whatnot.
It's a certain coloration, certainly. A helpful example that I've been thinking through personally through attending this reading group for the last 2.5 years is like, looking at some of these texts and, like Rousseau, or whatever, and just being like, my God, this stuff is dense. Man, this stuff is hard. But then slowly realizing, definitely with a bit of practice and a bit of skill and patience, it has become easier. But, that much we can expect. But there's this other side of it where it's like, actually, once upon a time, this wasn't necessarily that hard for intellectuals to read, at least. Like maybe the ordinary person who wasn't very literate might have a hard time, as always, but anyone who applied themselves might have certain presuppositions that they could bring to the table that they already knew through living in the time that they lived. I've heard that when Lenin was in Geneva, when he was in exile in Switzerland, I think this anecdote is right. I could be slightly wrong on the particulars, but the idea is that he read Das Kapital by Marx, and he just kind of flicks through it. He's like, yeah, I get the idea, sort of thing. Now, Lenin was a smart guy, and he, completed his law degree in 1 year and was at the top of his class and all this stuff. He was he was a genius, but I don't think that should that shouldn't give us the reason why he read that book. It was simply that he took a whole set of axioms for granted because he lived in the peak of the revolutionary movement for socialism. And he didn't get hung up on like every last sentence and every last passage like we might. Like, it is ideological that we pick up a text and we're like, what the fuck does this mean? We're blinded by the sheer weight and enormity and of the arcane language. We treat it as arcane, whereas once upon a time people were a bit more enterprising. This notion of this kind of Renaissance ideal of the well-rounded person, you know, who like aspires to like read Greek and Latin and all that sort of stuff, you know. People were trained to do it from a young age, but that had to come out of an impulse, a will, a desire to do it. I'm kind of going off the rails a bit, but I just want to make the general point that like reading this stuff is hard, but it's also easy. Right? Once you understand that you shouldn't miss the forest for the trees. You shouldn't be like, what is every single historical reference that this author is making? Just like, what is the broad thrust of the argument? And how is my reading of it coloured by the fact that I live in this historical moment and I don't live in theirs? Right? That will be the takeaway. And it is very misty-eyed, and I apologise. But it keeps you going, at least. It keeps you being like, all right, I'm going to keep attending this reading group. I want to see what these cranks are all about. Well, we're not cranks. That might be, you know, a skeptic's view if you were so inclined, but yeah, you don't have to be. Any final questions?
I've got work in the morning.
Of course.
As it were.
You've been very generous with your time. Appreciate it. Stay in touch. Thanks for coming.
I'll be in touch. Cheers.
See ya. All right.
Anything coming up soon, or just Tuesday, right?